From Redox and Healthcare Strategy Bullpen, welcome to Diagnosing Health Tech, the show where we talk about healthcare and the technology driving it with the most interesting leaders in the industry.
Marketer at Redox do?
That's a great question. We all know Redox is a highly technical product, and I get to tell stories about that product. So as we're coming out with new products and features and interesting things for y'all to use as you're setting up your integration strategy or interoperability platform, I get to tell you the value that Redox brings to your organization and why you should care about anything that we're creating. So I love to just tell stories about our products.
Well, that's great. And what are you working on currently?
That's a great question. So, the hot topic today and at Redox is, and has been for a really long time, FHIR, right? So just retelling that story from a Redox perspective about how we are able to really help organizations from start to finish tell their story or transform their patient journey through a FHIR API, regardless of what's on the other end, regardless of what EHR or organization that they're trying to connect to.
Well, that's terrific. Well, Elizabeth has been kind enough to agree to join us periodically on the podcast, so I'm sure we will hear more about that. So welcome to the launch of Diagnosing Health Tech. Our goal is for you to have a single place to keep up on the big issues in health tech. So we're going to start the podcast each week with some quick hits on top stories that have been broadly covered. Then we're going to do a deeper dive on some important stories that have gotten a little bit less coverage. And we're also going to have a guest interview each week, and that will be followed by Q&A. Our guest interview this week is Dr. Stephane Doyen. Stephane is the author of The 12 Plagues of AI in Healthcare and the chief data scientist at Omniscient Neurotechnology. But with that, let me dive into the quick hits. So first on the quick hits, this week, the weight loss and diabetes drug Wegovy, we found out that it cut the risk of cardiovascular disease by 20% in a large trial. The people in the trial were obese. They were 45 or older with type 2 diabetes. It is unknown if some patients were on other heart disease treatments such as statins, ACE inhibitors, or beta blockers that will be revealed later. And there is a question of how GLP-1 drugs work with other treatments for heart disease. Our take is that this will put pressures on some doctors for increased prescriptions, but employers are likely to push back for them to try other products first and other treatments first, and the safety profile for Wegovy is still unproven. In other news, Bessemer Venture Partners released its 2023 ranking of the top 100 private cloud companies. OpenAI was number one. There were 4 other native AI companies that made the index, including Anthropic, Midjourney, Hugging Face, and DeepL. To us, this reflects the fact that the global AI infrastructure market is projected to grow at 44% a year over the next 6 years. This is driven by the growth in AI and data AI intensive applications, such as generative AI, which has obviously been all over the place. We would expect to see this slowing down a little bit as the hype wears off going forward. Also, there were 5 takeaways from the health insurer's second quarter earnings reports. The medical costs have generally been higher, but they have been below the high end of the medical loss ratio range that caused a lot of concern in the Q1. Generally, utilization has been higher, but it's moving more towards outpatient, which has generally been our take. And last but not least, on the quick hits, there was a story in Politico this week on the 2024 GOP candidates' health policy focus. In terms of mental illness, both former President Trump and Governor DeSantis, including the potential of institutionalizing people with mental illness. In terms of Medicare, Governor Haley and former Vice President Pence talked about potential cuts over the long term in Medicare, and there were some potential changes to Medicaid. Overall, this bears watching. I think Trump is a very well-known factor in terms of his health policy, but should his poll numbers fade given his legal troubles, this could be a rather large issue. So with that, we will turn to some of our issues for discussion, and I will turn it over to Elizabeth to introduce some of those.
Yeah, thanks for that intro, Jeff. Definitely some interesting topics in there, but I'm really eager to dive in and jump into our news stories. So in today's segment, we're going to be talking about hospital performance. We're talking about some really, really big names in the enterprise hospital space and their Q2 2023 performance. Along that same breath, we're going to be talking about some data breaches and some risks associated specifically within the healthcare space. And finally, how communities are building their own power to improve their own health outcomes.
So first, in terms of the hospital performance, and we're looking here really at the public hospitals, and just from my prior life, these do tend to give a window and an earlier window into what's going on in the industry. And, the bulk of the industry is clearly not for profit, but what you have seen is generally a pickup in utilization. It's been in the high single digits generally, and there has been a pickup in surgeries. However, it's generally moving towards outpatient. So that has been fairly good. And in terms of revenues have been on the higher end, and that was part of the reason for the concern with MLRs, with the managed care companies. It's been in about a 4 to 6% band on the higher end of that. So that generally positive right now. You have seen some pent up demand, and from the people on the employer end that I've talked to, they do expect this to continue through 2024.
Yeah, I think we're definitely still in that sort of post-COVID hunger, right? That patients and consumers are still, they had 2 to 3 years of lockdown and lessened activity. People were scared to go to the doctor, for certain things, or they put off going to the doctor for certain things, especially if we're talking about elective surgeries, for example. But now, right, we're sort of in this post, open world where people are, going back and really being back and being involved with their healthcare providers. And it's still definitely higher than it was pre-COVID, but I think we are going to be getting back to like a stabilized world once more. What I find very interesting is the fact that there was this line, right, in the article that talked about, labor shortages persisting, right? And I'm not sure if you're aware, but, I'm a clinician, I'm a pharmacist. I've been in the setting where I've worked, at some of these like large institutions. And I wonder what the average clinician thinks about these sky high profits from these organizations, because, we see that line that talks about labor shortages and labor struggles. I wonder how much, is being, the hospitals are, not prioritizing proper staffing on the lines, right? We've seen nursing strikes, provider strikes all over the country. And to me, it's a sort of one story about sky high profits, right, on the sheet, but how are the actual clinicians on the ground feeling, right? In terms of, do they have enough people so that patient loads aren't so high? Do they feel as if they can participate in this joyous news as well? I doubt it.
Yeah, and I think that's correct. But part of the issue, at least, I think is there's actually been an inability in certain areas, particularly in nursing, which seems to be leveling off a bit, of the ability to even find people. And as we saw during COVID, the prices just got sky high, and we'll talk more about that in the next question, in terms of, or the next article, in terms of how is some of the M&A impacting different areas, and that's, I think, particularly interesting.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely some kind of provider shortage out there for sure. Not only because we're trying to produce as many providers, nurses, PAs, MDs as possible. But I think the pandemic also drove a lot of people out of healthcare, right?
Yeah.
People got burnt out. They were looking for alternative positions. And then we know the travel market, especially for nurses, is also dying down a little bit as well. I bet, this is just my perspective, I bet if organizations and these large hospitals were to reinvest, right, in increasing the wage of the average entry-level nurse, not a travel nurse, I wonder how much, I wonder how much they'd be struggling, right, to fill these roles. But that's just my perspective. Oh, Jeff, are you muted?
Whoops,
There
excuse
you
me.
are.
In terms of the second question, what are your thoughts, and this plays into it a little bit in terms of, some of the data breaches. I know this is a particularly interesting subject for you, and we've talked about, there's an article that, hospital data breach risk doubles just before and after M&A. This is an article on Healthcare Dive, and I'm curious as to your thoughts on that, Elizabeth.
Well, I think uh, I think we're in an unfortunate situation where news like this just doesn't surprise me. When you think about the value, right, of a patient's medical record, it's almost more valuable than their financial record, right? Because not only does it have financial information in there, if we're talking about, payment details or banking details and social security numbers, it has really, really precious, private information about patients that could be used in all sorts of ways on the, if you want to be real scary about it, on the dark web, maybe that can be sold. But because of how valuable that data is, right? Yeah, hospitals are just prime targets, for these breaches, not only by external actors, but maybe, by, you know, employees maybe who aren't trained properly on how to handle the data and how to be private with it. I was seeing, a statistic about how like, it's costing hospitals more and more money every time these data breaches happen. And I'm not an expert in cybersecurity, obviously, but it just feels as if, if on one hand, or these hospitals are reaching, really, really great profits, I hope that they're reinvesting, those, their monies and their revenue into boosting their cybersecurity efforts and their ability to really protect all this data that they generate so that patients can continue to have confidence in going to these areas and seeking care, and that they don't have to worry about their data potentially being lost or breached.
Yeah, I think the two things that hospitals, need to consider, one of these was in the article, one is having a risk mitigation plan.
Mhm.
And, the other is, I think part of this is as you get in and around, um, mergers and acquisitions,
Mhm.
the fact that, people become concerned about their jobs, and there has to be some reassurance given to people that, that if you make a mistake, you can come to us, if you see something, and
Yep,
it's not, particularly in an M&A situation where, there may be a counterpart on the other side who could get your job, that you won't be handled poorly. Um,
absolutely.
yeah.
Mhm. Yeah,
I am getting a quick cue from the producer to move us along. So let's just very quickly get to the third article on
sure.
the community. Do you want to cover that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I thought this was a really, really interesting conversation, that was being had in terms of how can communities empower themselves, right, to help, address, inequalities wherever inequities, excuse me, wherever they can see it. One thing I want to caution people, however, right, is that the focus of this article seemed to be, and while this is amazing, the emphasis was on the patients themselves, right, on the community themselves to arm themselves with knowledge and take action. I don't want to, leave out of this conversation the responsibility that the actual health systems have themselves to become further involved. There was a line in there that talked about how, when these communities come to these health systems and they ask for help, the health systems a lot of the times, or the committees that have been put up are like, well, what, they don't necessarily have um, really, really direct recommendations for how to work with these community groups, right? And they put the onus a lot on the groups themselves to advocate and talk about what they need. I would really like to welcome the health systems and the systemic people in power, right, to be able to come to this conversation prepared to actually have recommendations and direct actions. And a lot of that has to do, of course, with just how can we help people get the care they need in the most practical way. I mean, study after study have shown the best way to help people, especially marginalized people, is, give them the resources that they need, especially in the form of, wait for it, cash. Wait, are they able to, arrive to their appointments? Are they able to afford their medications? Are they able to take time off of work to come and be part of the conversation about how they can, meet their care gaps, and on and on and on. So that's my perspective. I don't want to let hospitals or health systems off the hook, but I'm really glad that we're showing what communities are doing to empower themselves to come to their providers prepared to have those conversations.
Yeah, and I think this is certainly an area we'll come back to, and I'll put in a shameless plug for our blog this week, which is on what resources that hospitals and others can use to screen people for social determinants of health. And as I said, we will come back to that. Let me move now, and I don't want to give that short shrift, so I'm sure we'll do a separate show on that because there's a number of resources, and I'd love to have you join on that.
Yeah.
So let's now look at our interview with Stephane Doyen. Stephane is in Australia, so we had to record record this earlier. Stephane is the author of The 12 Plagues in AI in Healthcare. He's an innovator and entrepreneur in neuroscience, data science, and AI. And as mentioned, he's the co-founder and chief data scientist of Mission Technology. And with that, we will cue up our interview. Welcome to our podcast, Stephane.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks. Very good to be here.
So Stephane, what I wanted to talk to you about was the article itself. And for those of you who don't know, Stephane has been doing some wonderful things in brain mapping, and I've already asked him to come back and join us again. And I really think you'll enjoy this. But in the article, Stephane, can you tell us how the article came about, and what brought you to write the article in the first place?
Sure. So I guess as a way of context, I must say I've been doing quote unquote AI, machine learning, statistical modeling for a good part of 20 years now. That number pains me every time I quote it, but it was machine learning before machine learning was cool. Applied to neuroscience back at the time when I was doing my PhD, and then moving on into various different fields. Some of which includes, retail, telco, banking, and all else. And very recently, in the past 3 years, I think, I started this company called Omniscient Neurotechnology. And as part of the core technology of Omniscient, we have to apply AI on the brain for the purpose of brain mapping, as you mentioned in the introduction. And so as I was in the process of creating the core algorithm, and trying to make sure that they comply for medical devices and having, systems that could be used on patients, I had to go through a lot of steps to make sure that everything was clean, working, and safe. And so the paper came about at the end of that journey when we got to a point where we were pretty happy with the results we were getting out of the AI. And I thought I would summarize those thoughts into a practical guide so that anyone else in the field that would like to follow my footsteps would be able to benefit from those learnings for their own devices.
Well, the paper, for those of you who have not read it, the paper is terrific. I highly recommend it. And if anyone wants a copy, please feel free to reach out to us. Happy to provide a copy. So, Stephane, well, the first thing I wanted to ask is, one of the things you mentioned is that AI often falls short of its potential and, has limited clinical impact. And I'm wondering if you could just, talk about what you found there and why.
Sure. So I come from a trade of, technology and neuroscience generally, and I'm generally quite excited when I see something new or some new capacity. But more often than not, I find that these new capacities don't land in the office of the doctor. And the reason for this is that there's a series of critical steps that are missing in delivering that piece of technology. We kind of stay on what's great and interesting, and sometimes omit what is actually useful. And what is useful is not always what is interesting from an AI or overarching technology standpoint. So I can give you an example, and I made that point in that paper, which is about practicality. say you create, a wonderful algorithm that can start mapping all the synapses that you find in the brain, and that's some work that's been done in the research side of the community. What you find that even if you were to get to something that's actually, let's say, meaningful in terms of mapping something you're interested to map in the brain, you're looking at a lot of connections for really big insights. So you might have a translation issue here, but nevertheless, let's assume you do so.
Hmm.
Once you release that system and you're getting to bring it to doctors, you also have to consider the systems that the doctors are working on. And if you've ever been into your doctor's office, you can see that they less often than you think of benefit than of the latest technology when it comes to computers. It's often, a good few years old laptops and so on and so forth. So having your system working on that, be it doing amazing things, you'll fall far short of your promise. And that's just one of the many examples by which, great systems, great engineering actually never properly lands in the hands of doctors and ultimately never get to patients and deliver the impact they need.
And I'm going to step back for a sec, but then I want to follow up on that. You mentioned that in the paper that applications of AI in medicine can be grouped into what you refer to as two bold promises. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that, and then I wanted to follow up on your last response.
Sure. So, when I look at it, AI in general is a toolbox. And then the example I make is when that toolbox is specifically applied to medicine. But I think some of the learnings that I share there can be applied across the board in other fields. And in the field of medicine in general, there's a lot of activities that needs to be done, but two more specifically where AI can be useful. One of which is diagnostic. And diagnostic is something we've seen a lot of in terms of AI systems enabling that, and more specifically, streamlining processes in the past few years. So typical, AI systems we see now in the field is you have a radiologist, for instance, that has, several hundreds of scans to go through in a day. And then there's a flagging system that says, well, this one might be fine, and this one you want to have a second look. And this is extremely helpful when you have a large amount of information and then you need to go through it with a limited amount of time. That's one part where the diagnostic, powered AI can be found most often in doctor's office. The second part is about treatment. And this is not so much about streamlining a set of operations or automating a set of operations. This is about reducing bias. So when you think about the case you've got at hand, you've got a patient in front of you. Well, that patient is connected to a wide array of information. You've got all the tests that have been ran, the scans that are available, the blood test, the measurement, but also things like family history and the latest, advances in genetics that you need to be aware. There's a lot of information, and all that information needs to collide in a single point. And that single point is what the doctors have in front of them so that they can make a decision or a set of constrained decision for a treatment plan. And in here, the approach is a little bit different. It's reducing all that complexity to enable less biased and more encompassing treatment options.
And when you refer to less bias, you mean both the doctor's personal bias, maybe towards certain treatments, and also maybe the biases or biases that are inherent in training, either racial, ethnic, or otherwise. Am I correct?
Yes, in general, the idea is that if you consider more information, your system can be overloaded because you've got too much to think about. And so you select piecemeal certain piece of information. But when you have a large array of information and AI helps you to pick the ones that are more relevant for you to do the next level of thinking, you're actually considering more information for one decision that you would if you didn't have an AI system. Whether the other biases, let's say ethnical bias and such, appear, is more upstreams in how the data was generated, which is somewhat of another problem.
Interesting, really interesting. So let me take you back to your previous answer. You were talking about one of the problems, how you defined practicality in the paper. And what I thought was super interesting, you said, and pardon me for looking at my notes here, but you said building a model which has limited practical applications in the environment of interest due to logistical constraints that were not considered outside the environment where the model was created in. And you gave the example of the doctor's office. And one of the things you talked about in the paper several times was the need to make sure you involve the users in the design of the model. So can you talk about the issue of practicality and how you bring in the users into the model as well?
Sure, I can actually give you an example that I personally faced and also explain in the paper. So think about it. I was talking about the Synapse example, and it's actually a piece of work that's been done by a large technology firm. They created amazing mapping of the hemibrain of a Drosophila fly. It took them, I don't know how many hours. It's reported on the website, but this is a staggering amount. So basically, you're cutting the brain of that fly microns by microns, and then if one slice fails, then you've got to, do it again, and you end up with a tremendously detailed mapping of that fly. Okay, say you're able to achieve the same thing with a human. You end up with an amazing mapping of every single connections that are available in the human brain, trillions of them. Say you have that. It's a wonderful technological achievement. What would a doctor do with that quantity of information when they have in front of them a patient that is, complaining about having been sad for, past few months without apparent reasons? There's a problem in the complexity that your model is actually bringing out there, and there's explanation gap that need to be bridged to the patient's, symptoms. And so bringing on board your users early on can help to solve this in a way that once you get into that such a complex details, they would tell you this is a wonderful technological achievement, but there's not much I can do with it. What if you could, instead of that, pull out a set of limited information out of that large data set you're working on, and just tell me what I should be thinking about or looking at when I'm in front of my patients. And that can help you to guide how you craft your model in the number of variables you take into account, but also the type of output you're looking at in terms of complexity and constraints of users down the line.
So last but not least, and I thought this was probably one of the most fascinating things you pointed out, was the problem of practicality, and this is specifically in a hospital context. And you said that the systems need to be developed for the environment which they're going to be deployed. And you touched on it, I think, earlier a little bit in practicality. But can you talk about this in really in a hospital context?
Okay. Practicality is important because you can create an amazing piece of engineering. That piece of engineering will be no good if never anyone uses it. So you have to make sure that your user can access it and find a use for it in their practices. And I think that's important. I can take the example of surgery and more specifically, neurosurgery, which I've been, trying to help for the past few years. And what you find is that these procedures are extremely complex. And when we say procedure, there's a set of steps that needs to happen from the initial, meeting the patient all the way to post-surgery and follow-up. These steps needs to be put in a certain order. And so when you're introducing a new system in a procedure, that procedure needs to be adapted to account for that new system. Say, speaking of my company, we do brain mapping. And so you're introducing now in a neurosurgical workflow a map of the brain where before there was only a scan. Okay, well, that's very useful, but where does that sit in the doctor's, planning, and where does that sit currently in surgery? So you got to think about all these things. And if you just come and say, well, here's a solution, here's a map, do it this way, you'll find that the user will withdraw and won't adopt your system. But if you say, well, here's a piece of information you can use at that point in time, And guess what? This is the moment you're on your computer, so it actually really is at hand when you're actually looking at your screen and it's directly relevant for your case. Then suddenly you're embedding yourself into the current procedure, and therefore you're more likely to be adopted as part of it and deliver the impact you need from what you've created.
Yeah, and that would seem that you'd even have to get into the workflows and where this particular map would sit in field of vision and things like that. Would that be correct?
Yeah, in building the system, I did spend quite a bit of time in operating theaters and talking to doctors and things. And so this is, AI in the field. It doesn't get better than that. And this is the kind of thing that, make the quality of your system overall is how well you are embedded in that system.
This has just been fascinating, Stephane. And as I said, just from our first prep conversation, I'm really, fascinated by what you do. I think your work is terrific. As I've said, we'd love to have you back to talk about what you're doing at Omniscient and on the brain mapping. So I'm sure we will arrange that. I wanted to thank you very much for, all of your time and all of your expertise, and highly recommend the article, to everyone.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was great. Thanks, Jeff.
Well, that was really great, Jeff. I really appreciated Dr. Doyen's insights, and definitely going to make sure that I review that article afterwards.
Well, thank you. He's done some really interesting stuff, and as I said, we'll have him back in terms of what they're doing with brain mapping and AI and a number of other things. There is, one question in the chat, and I'll throw it to you first, Elizabeth. It says, in your opinion, what needs to be done from a policy perspective to ensure ethical AI?
I think that's a great question. I also think we don't have to overthink it, right? We have a number of policies today that help protect patients, right? And help in terms of when their data is being used for clinical research or for, just creating new health policy. And we have a wealth of privacy, privacy rights that we have here. Obviously, any of that could be strengthened. I also think that, today, what are the protections that we have in place for ethical use of any other kind of data? I think can be, relatively easily applied to whatever AI is being done in terms of, we look at whatever policy we have in place for big data today, I think can translate relatively easy to AI as well. I wouldn't want us to think we have to come up with the most perfect policy or think of something brand new for this new iteration of technology. But I'd love to hear your perspective on that as well.
I think it's still evolving. I was talking with a major player, this week, that I think it's going to depend on a number of, the different pilots and what we do. But I would stress a couple of things. One is I do think the need to, audit the models, both, pre and post, and, deployment, and to continue to look at, what we do. As is there model drift, as we talked about in the fuller conversation with Stephane? Are they continuing to use the information in the ways it's intended? And
Right.
I think there are a number of things that we need to continue to look at, but this will be an evolving area. And as we talked about in terms of community involvement, this will be another area for the show as we go forward. Let me see if there are any other questions. I do not see any other questions. I know we're running over. So with that, let me wrap it up here for our first show. I do want to say I appreciate everyone joining. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you, Elizabeth, for taking the time out of your day. We hope everyone will join us every Thursday at 11. Please feel free to suggest ideas and guests. This is an iterative process. We'd love to have you here to discuss the latest breakthroughs in the interactive world of healthcare. Any comments on your side, Elizabeth?
Yeah, no, this has been just wonderful. I really have appreciated being a guest. I certainly plan on showing up more if you'll have me. And yeah, as a thank you to our sponsors, this show wouldn't be possible without them. Want to express gratitude to Healthcare Strategy Bullpen. They're a top-tier strategy consulting firm devoted to guiding digital healthcare innovators and aligning them with strategic clients.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. From our side, if you're a provider or payer, Healthcare Strategy Bullpen can help you separate the transformative tech from the marketing hype and maximize your ROI on technology investments. If you're a digital health innovator, we can help you navigate the complex areas of selling into healthcare and increase your win rates. Please feel free to go to our website, healthcarebullpen.com, to learn more about us. Our next guest next week will be Dr. Aziz Naha. Aziz is the Executive Director of Global Early Drug Development for Insight Pharma, and he is the former director of the Cleveland Clinic Center for Clinical Artificial Intelligence. I think he'll be, really enjoyable. I just want to turn over to you for any last comments before we sign out, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I don't think we can sign off without also thanking Redox for sponsoring this show as well. Whether you're a provider, payer, or vendor, and you want to connect with providers, Redox is spearheading implementation of big data and AI and cloud computing for all of you healthcare trailblazers. So until next episode, keep asking important questions, keep learning, and join us next week. Thank you.